Good morning again. I am really delighted to be here with you all. And I promise you, I will not be singing today, just, just so that I don't sound like I am in some Canadian Idol show or something. Okay. So I decided to call my message this morning, Discovering the Daily Accompaniment of the Spirit. Sometimes it is possible that we may be so busy with things that it is necessary to stop, to pause for a few seconds and ask ourselves, where is the Spirit in my life? And that's what I want to leave with you this morning. The passage of the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, verses 1 to 13, we just read, our sister just read, often is talked about as Jesus's temptation. One of the first things to which we must pay attention is that whoever wrote the account must have received it from Jesus himself. You see, because he was the only person in the desert, in the wilderness, when this was going on. This is what in biblical scholarship is called the omniscient author. That is to say, the author who knows everything that is going on, even though he was never there. And this is one of those instances in which the author is reporting to us what happened with Jesus during those 40 days of his fasting, but he was also not there. The passage is also known to us because it is an intimate connection with the period of Lent. As all of you know, Lent is the period of 40 days of preparation before Easter. In a way, the beginning of Lent marks for us an orientation, invites us to orient ourselves to what is to come in Easter. And what I want to do today, this morning, or at least in the remaining minutes that I have, is to think of ourselves how we can best prepare for Easter. In theological conversations, this passage is usually much debated. On one hand, we know that the Bible text uses the language of temptations to speak about human beings as well as of God. So the language of temptation has multiple meanings. On one hand, it means being tested, which is the version that we use today to read to speak about Jesus. Other times, it also means being on trial for something. And curiously enough, other instances also means to go outside of one's character and do or have a proclivity or a tendency to do evil. Most curious for me is that in the biblical text, God is often also tempted. So think about that. Now, we all know the order of the temptations: to turn rocks into bread, to switch Jesus's allegiances to the devil in order to become the Lord of the whole world, and to test the divine promise to keep us from harm. The first temptation may be read as focusing on Jesus's physical appetites and needs. He was hungry. Have you ever fasted? It is crazy. It is hard because your belly and your body is telling you, you better eat. The fundamental need here manifest is that Jesus is simply hungry. And the apparent temptation is for him to ameliorate his hunger through the exercise of his divine power. In other words, to forget the very character of his own humanity. You see, in no other moment in the biblical text we see Jesus' humanity so clearly manifest as when he was hungry. And in his desire to resolve the situation, to fix the situation, he is now tested to fix it by going outside of his humanity and exercise his divine power. So what I want to invite you to think about is that in wanting to or being tempted to turn those rocks into bread, Jesus is being invited to ignore that, in fact, he should depend on God to solve his problems. And that's an important shift that the gospel offers us. Now, meanwhile, the second temptation amplifies our invitation for Jesus to transgress his very own nature by wanting to lord over the world. Again, his temptation has more to do with human greed and thirst for power. To yield into this temptation would amount to an act of selfishness that would make things work out for the benefit of his own interest, right? For his benefit, and forget about his original vocation. Jesus came to the earth not to lord over the earth, but to be for the earth and offer himself for it, for us. So while the first temptation focuses on fixing difficult situations by focusing on Jesus' own needs, the second temptation relates specifically with losing the capacity to see how one is interconnected with other people. The first temptation refers to taking control of creation. You see, I am going to turn this stone into bread. Whereas the second one focuses on taking control of the world and not care of the world or for the world. So the temptation at its very heart is proposing Jesus to go outside of his humanity to seek for other ways of fixing things without depending on God. In a society in which all that matters is the need of the individual, the rights of the individual, and focusing on one's desires and wants, it is easy to forget how connected we all are to each other, because we all are, as was said earlier, children of God. So I want to invite you this morning to look at the person to your right and to your left and tell them, you are a child of God. Can you do that? Can you look at them and say, you are a child of God? That is a profound truth. Let me just add. It is not every day that we stop and say or think, I am a child of God, by the way. And whatever is happening to me, God has control of. That is a phenomenal truth that we must reflect on. Now, these two first temptations are brought together by the very last temptation, I should add. The apparent provocation to jump from the highest point or the pinnacle of the temple is seemingly intended to test whether, in fact, God will intervene and save Jesus. The implication is whether God will violate natural rules to safeguard Jesus' well-being. What I find surprising, however, is that Jesus' refutation places the emphasis not on God, who cares, but on humanity to believe that God cares. You see the difference? Jesus' emphasis and response is not to express his disbelief. No, God is not going to do that. But in fact, you shouldn't even bother with what God is going to do because I must believe that God cares for me. That's important. The language, though, of not tempting God relates directly to not creating circumstances in which God would be required to go outside of God's self to save us from circumstances in which we have placed ourselves in danger. In other words, one's faith in God requires not to engage in capricious behaviors and then measure God's love on whether God comes and saves us. Now, one good example is our present situation of global warming and geopolitical turmoil. I'm sure if you see the news, right now the world is in a mess. But both have been created by human greed and incapacity to coexist with nature or with people who are different than us. And it is this greed that, in this case, the devil is in this story is attempting to provoke Jesus to see whether there is any glimpse of that greed in him, and he's just gonna have none of that, because for him, he's not here to lord the world, but to save the world. You, as a child of God, then, are here not just to live for yourself, but to live for another. That's the shift that I want to emphasize. One of the aspects, however, that we forget to notice in this passage is the mention of the Spirit. The Spirit is the one that is present and guiding Jesus. Throughout his period of fasting and spiritual preparation, it is the Spirit that was present accompanying Jesus, which to me unveils a critical aspect of the reality of temptation. All of us, or maybe none of you, but I am for sure, tempted at some point or other. At some point, we wish to resolve difficult situations prematurely, or sometimes even wish to take shortcuts. Many of us sometimes wish to have control of all of our situations so that things come out to our benefit. And many of us sometimes have been in situations in which we have to beg the divines to come and save us because we're in a real difficult mess in which we got ourselves. And I want to invite you to think about that this is precisely how it would be good for us to read this passage. Because it mentions that the Spirit is with Jesus. So whether we are at the height of our lives and everything is going well, or when we are at our lowest points and often encounter despair and loneliness, the Spirit is present. In fact, when we are in situations in which we find ourselves utterly vulnerable, there, I want to emphasize, the Spirit of God will become manifest. Notice then that, as I mentioned at the beginning, it was Jesus who must have reported this incident. He obviously also reported that he managed to overcome the obstacles he encountered, both by his faith commitment to God, but also by the accompaniment of the Spirit, ensuring that God's care and comfort was present even through his most difficult moments. So as we begin Lent, let us remember that the Spirit of God is among us, with us, and for us. That with whatever we need, the divine Spirit already knows it. As Paul wrote in the book of Romans, chapter 8, verses 26 and 27, that the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know what we ought to pray for. But this Spirit intercedes for us with wordless groans. Can you picture that? Have you ever groaned? When you have no longer words, when your words betray you, when you are in such a situation where no word will express what you're feeling, groans emerge. And the passage says, the Spirit prays for us, intercedes for us with wordless groans. And just in case you were doubting, the apostle continues saying, the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with God's will. Isn't that wonderful? So as I finish, I want us to reflect on where we see the Spirit at work in our daily lives and in people. I want you to reflect for a few seconds. Do you see it on the bus driver who lowers the bus so that you may not stumble? Or perhaps in the cashier at the grocery store who helps you find the price of an item? Or the doctor who helps you dealing with your own ailments? Or the members of your family who sometimes are difficult, but sometimes take the time to be with us to let us know that we belong? Where do you see the Spirit? For Jesus, throughout the 40 days of his dedication and time and fasting, precisely at the end, he was at his lowest point. But it was at this very low point that the Spirit helped him, accompanied him. In the same way, it is the Spirit that will guide us throughout our mundane tasks and reminds us that we are children of God, that we belong because God is for us. Amen.